All right, so just like we started on day one and how we started on day two, we'll be starting our time together with some land, labor, and knowledge acknowledgements, and then passing it over to 2021 Menominee Brave Lewis Cat for an opening prayer. All right, y'all. So for land, we must acknowledge this land was stolen. We acknowledge we currently gather upon the earth that our First Nations peoples originally inhabited and still remain. Our presence would not be possible without their caretaking and continued contributions of our tribal nations of Wisconsin. For labor, we acknowledge the labor of Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have come before us, who have for generations sacrificed their lives to build this place we can now call home. Our presence would not be possible without their grit, resilience, and freedom dreams. For knowledge, we acknowledge that we are only vessels of this work and that knowledge and ideas belong to the universe. What you hear during our time together is a culmination of wisdom acquired from experiences. We must honor our responsibility to pass on what we learn and unlearn with others in the spirit of reciprocity. All right, so with that, I'll pass it over to Louis Katcak for our opening prayer. Go ahead, Louis.
Masunok Mashik Malkohano, the Kato Manwich Kikitim, Nima Mutton, so past Natolian, so past Kanapamia, so past Nanamia. And when the Katan Moni Kako in its case Mankea, so past Ramaxia, Mashik Muskozovin. Mass Masunok Mashik Malkohano, Tanmakunuk, Net. Grandfathers and fathers of all, I'm going to speak a little. I plead with you in a good way to hear me. So in a good way, you will watch over us until you think of us. Thank you, I say, for everything that you have given us, so we will have life and strength. Grandfathers and fathers of all my relatives, thank you.
Yawanko Louis, thank you so much for opening up our space. Awesome. Welcome, Kyle. All right, y'all. So this is day three. It's the final day. We're super excited to have our day three keynote with us. The unique thing about Kyle being here with us today is he's also leading a workshop after the keynote. So two opportunities to share his wisdom and experience with us. And so I'm so honored and have a pleasure to introduce Kyle, poet, educator, activist, two-time National Poetry Slam champion, who will be leading a keynote today titled Building a Culture of Consent, Spoken Word and Counter Narrative. Welcome, Kyle. Welcome, Kyle. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you for this opportunity, first of all. My name is Tran Myhre. My stage name is Guante. I use he, him, his pronouns. When I lived in Minneapolis, but I actually grew up in the La Crosse area and went to school at UW-Madison. So Wisconsin is home in a lot of ways, and it's always good to be able to connect with people there. Um, Basically, I'm a poet, and most of the work that I do is about, I guess, using poems as entry points into dialogue, using stories and art to, I guess the word is cultivate critical thinking about issues, particularly issues related to consent, healthy sexuality. And in my own case, I write a lot about masculinity and what like a healthy masculinity can or might look like. Um, and so when I show up in spaces like this, as a keynote or a performer or a presenter, um, I'm definitely not here as like an expert or an authority who's gonna like teach you the truth about the world or anything like that. I'm an artist, and I think the privilege of being an artist is that I don't have to have all the answers, right? I tell stories, share perspectives, that kind of stuff. The other little framing note I'll share is that I generally don't like to just talk for 45 minutes straight, but because of the virtual format and because there's like a bunch of you, it'll be a little more presentation-y, but feel free to use the chat box if people have thoughts, questions, comments, things that you pull out from what I'm saying. And then I will also try to like break up this presentation a little bit with some poems too, so I'm not just talking the whole time. Cool. That sound good? Um, so I guess, before we do anything else, the best way to introduce myself might just be to share a poem. So I'll do that, and then I'll talk a little bit about what this poem means in the context of the actual topic today. Because, like, the topic is, as the title says, building a culture of consent. This isn't a poem about consent, but I'm sharing it for very like intentional reasons, and then we'll talk about that in a second. So the poem is called Handshakes. This kind of subtitle of it is On Letting Go. The weirdest thing about having your hand crushed is that the pair of eyes across from yours never stop smiling. As knuckles are compressed, as the skin is all but torn off the top of your hand, he always has this grin on his face. Even as the vein bulges from his neck, he smiles until you grudgingly mumble, "That's quite a handshake," and he releases you. Um, as a young man, I was taught that one's masculinity is tied directly to one's handshake, right? That when meeting another man for the first time, no sin was more unforgivable than placing a fish in his hand, the dead husk of a greeting. Your grip must be firm, like the way you hold your briefcase when you walk to work, or the way you hold the handle while standing up on the bus. Fine. Some men, however, and maybe you've experienced this and maybe you haven't, but some men prefer a grip like a battle axe mid-swing, like ripping the head off an antelope by tugging on the antlers. Some men treat every handshake like a gladiator's death match, a test of strength, a test of will. And when I meet these men, as I like weirdly often do, their tectonic plate handshakes never fail to illuminate my myriad insecurities. Frozen there with purple fingertips, I'm reminded of the fact that I, you know, can't stand the taste of beer. That, like, cars, I don't know anything about cars. They confuse and frighten me. That I always skip leg day at the gym. That when faced with a barbecue and a pair of tongs, I am going to overcook the meat every time. These men attempt to squeeze the testosterone from my body. And yeah, maybe I'm just insecure. Um, But studying his smirk more closely, I wonder if maybe that would make two of us. Because as the color drains from my fingertips, I find myself wanting to ask him, do you ever feel trapped in the mornings when you're watching TV and watching, downing that protein shake made from raw eggs and liquefied steak and Axe body spray? Do you ever crush the glass between your fingers by accident? Do you ever get tired of that voice in the back of your head? The one that is, every day constantly telling you to reaffirm that you are a real man by, catcalling women and eating enormous hamburgers and getting into physical altercations over nothing, or I don't know, squeezing things really, really hard. I find myself wanting to ask him, do you hold your wife's arm like this when you're angry with her? Is there a teddy bear somewhere in your history being ripped away from a pair of hands that just aren't strong enough? Do you remember the first time your father wouldn't let you hold his hand when you crossed the street? Do you remember the way he looked at you? Do you remember being handed your firstborn son and not knowing how to hold him? Do you remember squeezing his shoulders like this the first time he disappointed you? Do you remember what it was you were trying to hold on to? And I know that there is just so much space between us as men that sometimes we feel compelled to cram as much contact as we physically can into every touch. I know we become so comfortable with crushing, so hypnotized by our own strength, we forget how incredible it can feel to let go. Cool. So yeah, I know the ASL interpreters are getting lots of shout outs, which I think is good. So thank you. I know sometimes spoken word and my natural speaking voice is also pretty fast. So I'm trying to be at a good pace here. So basically, you know, if we had all the time in the world and we were in a room together or whatever, like I would ask you questions about what you noticed, what you pulled from the poem, how you related or didn't relate to it. Cause like those are both important questions. Um, I'll just share really, really quickly two reasons I share that poem right away in the context of a conversation about consent and building a culture of consent. You know, first, obviously consent is a relevant and important topic in all kinds of relationships to people from who hold all different gender identities, right? Um, but as myself, as like a cisgender straight guy, it's important to me to explore how issues related to gender violence, domestic violence, and sexual violence are so often connected to masculinity. Kind of the stories that were told growing up about manhood, about, you know, just like what a quote unquote man is supposed to be. So this is a poem that tries to make some space for just some critical thinking about that. And how important it is to, you know, you see like the surface level stuff, like the real men don't wear pink, which I think is maybe a little less common in this generation than in like generations past. Like it's maybe more common to see how silly some of that stuff is. But even when you dig past the quote unquote silly stuff, there's also some really, really serious stuff about, again, the story we tell about men and what it means to be a man is so often a story of control and dominance and power. And, you know, just how unhealthy that can be, particularly when we start a conversation about consent. So again, that could be a whole conversation itself. Um, and the second reason I wanted to share that poem though, was because it demonstrates something that I think poetry does that also relates directly to activism and advocacy. Um, because when we talk about building a culture of consent, that's, you know, to me is an activist question, and it can be an overwhelming question, right? Like culture is such a huge, giant thing. How does one person like engage with that? And that, you know, think about the poem. The poem takes this really, really, really big concept, this big idea, like whether you call it toxic masculinity or hegemonic masculinity or whatever vocabulary word you use. But it doesn't just talk about that issue, it zooms in on it until it's something small, a single moment where you meet someone for the first time and they shake your hand really, really hard, right? A lot of poems do that. If any of you are spoken word fans, slam poetry fans, you take a big abstract issue and you zoom in on it until it's something real, so you can put a human face on it. And as we'll explore today, like activism and advocacy really mirrors that process. You take a big, complex issue, like how do we build a culture of consent? And you zoom in on it and try to figure out specific ways to plug in, to take a first step or to like show up. So yeah, and you know, I'll share some more poems and what have you later. Um, but I think, you know, before we get to those, we could explore that notion a little bit, about, you know, what it means to build a culture of consent outside of like the art side of that conversation. Because I think, you know, sometimes when we hear words like art and poetry and culture, they're so often presented as these like magical, mystical things that only certain people have the power to do anything with. And, you know, I don't think that's true. I think it's important to acknowledge that there is like an arts-based side of culture change, but there's also a everyday people living their lives doing stuff side of culture change. So we can start there. I will share my screen again, if that's okay. I won't be doing another poem for a little while still, so we won't have to worry about that. Cool. So, okay, so I was looking at the chat, and then I also saw the Q&A box. So like, yeah, I might miss some stuff, but I will be sure to keep checking in as we keep going. The chat's a little easier to see just for your own reference. But yeah, we might come back to some of the Q&A stuff. Basically, so this first slide, which I assume you can see now, um, I just want to start with this idea that like culture building and culture shifting is something that not only everybody can do, but I think everybody does do, whether we know it or not, because culture is formed and created through our actions and also through our inactions. Um, and so, as an example, a concept you might already be familiar with or maybe had other workshops on is the idea of rape culture. The idea that sexual assault, harassment, violence aren't just disconnected individual acts by individual bad people, right? But they have deeper roots in the culture. And of course, we can talk about culture in a more specific sense, but what I'm referring to with this presentation is kind of the idea of a dominant US like mass media culture, which we don't all interface with in the same way, but we do all kind of have to deal with just because it's so dominant. It's kind of the background radiation of movies and TV shows and music, and also just conversations like that might come up in real life with family and friends. It's the stories we tell about gender, masculinity, power, all that kind of stuff. So like again, to use the rape culture example, is stuff like what normalizes or kind of excuses or makes invisible that kind of violence. So stuff like victim blaming, right? Like what were they wearing? Or objectification, seeing people only as objects of desire and not as full human beings. And then, drawing from my own work, a kind of hyper masculinity that says, you're only a real man if you're always in control and always get what you want and are always dominant. And again, today's presentation isn't like a rape culture 101 thing. That's a super abbreviated version we could spend a lot more time on. But the question that I'm interested in is kind of the opposite of it. Um, if we think about gender violence and sexual assault having roots in the broader culture, there's a flip side to that, which is how do we build a culture of consent where it isn't just about individual people making good individual choices, but that it's something that is more deeply ingrained and embedded in the stories we tell, the attitudes and values that we're raised with, the habits we form, policies, laws, and systems that we move through, all of that stuff. So all of those questions became the basis for, if you see the image there, the thing on the right is the cover of a zine. And so if you never heard the word zine, like Z-I-N-E, it's like a little magazine, right? It's like a little booklet. And basically, for my work as a poet, I travel a lot. And I'm in a lot of different places and meet a lot of amazing people who do this kind of activist and advocacy work every day. And so a lot of times at the end of a workshop or in the middle of a discussion, we'd write this question on the board: how do we build a culture of consent? And just have people answer it. And so all the stuff I'm going to share today isn't just like from me, it's from people who are doing this work. Like I'm just, the messenger. But it's from advocates, students, survivors, people who are really trying to make this real in a real way. Cool. So before we actually get into the zine, like I figured on the third day of a conference like this, I probably don't need to do a full-on like in-depth consent 101. But it's always good to have a review or to hear different ways of how people approach the topic. So before we talk about building a culture of consent, we'll talk just a little bit about consent. And if you have favorite definitions or links or resources that you want to share with people, like I'm really interested in creating definitions that are impressionistic, that bring lots of different perspectives. So feel free to share them in the chat box. Basically, the zine here has two short definitions right on the cover and a more inside, but one of them is that consent is informed, freely and affirmatively communicated willingness to participate in sexual activity that is expressed by clear and unambiguous words or actions. That's from the Aurora Center. Another one on the cover there is consent is a mutual verbal, physical, and emotional agreement that happens without manipulation, threats, or head games. That's Project Respect. there are a million other definitions, and feel free to share them. But basically, if people are going to engage in any kind of sexual or physical, or I think even emotional activity, they need to be on the same page, right? They need to know beyond any shadow of a doubt that they are on the same page by communicating clearly and constantly, being present and like listening, you know. And there are, a lot of other good definitions, but I think one thing I would add to those two is the idea that consent isn't just about sex, that it's a foundational part of like healthy relationships in general, romantic, sexual, or otherwise. It's about, to me at least, honoring that other people are people, right? And respecting them and their choices, about basic empathy and just clear communication. And so if that's kind of the foundation of what we're talking about, this organizer frame here is the idea that, like you said, culture building is something that everyone does, whether we know it or not. And well, let me jump to the next slide. So the way that the zine is like organized is the idea that this is just a framework that I found to be really, really, really useful, especially for those of you who are interested in getting into the world of activism and organizing. Whenever an issue feels too big to do anything about, whether that is, rape culture or other issues too, institutional racism, the prison industrial complex, the climate crisis, whatever, it can help to break things down into pieces, right? So in this diagram, there's the idea that change happens, culture is built at an individual level. You as one person by yourself can do things like read books and increase our own capacity for doing work. That also happens at an interpersonal level, which is like, who do we have direct access to? Friends, family, our networks, our like social media, that kind of stuff. What types of communication stuff can we do? And then, the third level here is institutional, the idea that culture is also impacted and impacts systems, laws, policies, all of that stuff. And the idea here is that for change to happen, for culture to be built, it takes all three levels. The three different levels like support one another. An important note is that we don't all have to do everything all of the time, right? It's about figuring out how to plug into this larger ecosystem in a way that like makes sense to you and your interests and your strengths and just where you're at in your life, right? Showing up in one way, whether that's just like reading a book, can open doors to other types of action and activism later. And so, I think, this is a lesson that relates to a lot of different issues, but that you don't have to know the entire like wholeness of your journey to take a first step. Even if you don't know 100% where you're going, that first step of showing up is a really important step. But yeah, we can actually get specific. And so the next few slides might have a lot of text on them. We don't have to actually sit and like go through each one. It's more just to get an idea of what the zine says. And again, they'll share the link earlier. I can share the link again in a little bit. But basically, again, when I traveled around and asked all these different advocates and survivors and activists, how do you build a culture of consent? Here are some of the responses. If we look just at the individual level, what can you as one person just sitting alone by yourself in your room do? A lot of it comes down to, or what people said is like learning, right? So like reading books, reading articles, taking classes when that's available, listening to people, like real listening to people in our lives, but also just people. Part of that can involve moving beyond the dominant narrative, making sure that we understand consent outside of the way, like the main way that it's often talked about in like trainings and stuff, but knowing that, same-sex relationships or relationships with people of all gender identities, like consent is important. How these issues tie into race and class and the other identities that we hold, there's all this complexity there that's important to see. Another, a really easy action step that a single person can do is to get plugged in. So like if you, Google or do a web search of like your city or your county or your state, plus, domestic violence advocates or support for survivors or gender justice, or something like some search term like that, and just see what's already happening, see who's already doing this work, and follow them. Sign up for email lists, just stuff like that. It seems really simple, but again, that whole like zooming in thing, like the little simple steps are really, really important because they can often be the first step. And then the last one here, of course, this could be a whole 45-minute workshop just on consent. But we at least have to say, like, to practice consent, right? In our relationships, in our lives. And I think that word practice is a good intentional word, because it's like, on one level, it can mean like, do it, like practice consent, but it can also literally mean to practice, to, communicate openly and honestly, and like run through scenarios, stuff like that. Again, this is just a quick version. You can read all this stuff in the zine. But if we jump into the interpersonal level, the idea that in community with one another, we can step up and do more. A lot of times what people told me is that breaks down to like dialogue. If there are book clubs, discussion groups, classes, whether real life or virtual spaces where people can just like talk about stuff and process stuff together. And that can be social media. Social media can be a terrible place, but it can also be a really amazing place. A lot of it depends on how we curate like the people we're in community with. And so like that could be part of it there. And that relates to the next point on the thing here is speaking out, right? Posting stuff on social media, writing like letters to the editor, writing stuff for school newspapers, using whatever platform we have, no matter how many followers we have, any of that stuff, just using whatever platform we have to have more conversations, challenge myths. And I think a really important one here is the idea of signal boosting. If you haven't heard that term before, you may have heard that term before, but if you haven't, we don't always feel like we know everything. We probably shouldn't feel that we know everything, that we're experts. Signal boosting is like, how do we, highlight the people who do know what they're talking about. So again, signal boosting organizations, activists who are doing this work. Another point on the list here is supporting survivors, whether those survivors are ourselves or just people in our lives, in our orbit. That link there to an organization called Know Your Nine. If anyone wants to type that, transcribe that into the chat box, please do. Has a really good like how to support survivors in our lives kind of checklist. And it's not a checklist, but like kind of a do's and don'ts. A really good resource. And then finally, like bystander intervention, again, could do a whole 45-minute training on bystander intervention, but the basic idea, which you may have already taken other workshops on or whatever, is, how do we step up both to address harm when it's happening, but also to like prevent harm. Am I having a conversation with my friends when they say something sexist? Or maybe am I having a conversation with my friends before they ever say something sexist, right? To be preemptive and proactive about it. So some stuff there. Jumping into the policy, the institutional side of how people respond to that question about building a culture of consent. A lot of times that involves organizing, right? Whether that's joining an organization or like taking a training to become an advocate yourself. Or supporting organizations through donations, signal boosting, organizing fundraisers. Like that's how this stuff works. Like that down to earth, boots on the ground, like work that needs to happen. And I think organizing sometimes people think about it just in terms of like changing the Constitution or whatever, but it can be very, very local. It can be changing a policy at your school, right? Like maybe it's a dress code policy. I know people have a lot of opinions about dress code policies. Or maybe it's, well, there'll be an example in a second of different policies people have fought for. Other ways to plug into policy work, that could be voting. It could also be when someone is in power, no matter what party they belong to, like how are we putting pressure on them through different types of organizational struggle, working on issue campaigns. So not just candidates or parties, but issues, that can be a thing. And then, for young people who are thinking about the future, another point that people bring up in this conversation is like thinking about your career path. Obviously no one has to know what you're doing with your life right now in this moment, but to think critically about like, maybe you want to go into a field or maybe take some classes that might point you in the direction of a field that can have a real impact on these issues that we're talking about, whether that's law or politics or media or whatever. Um, and again, I'm just moving through these like texty slides, but the next one is just so that that question about organizing isn't too abstract. So it's kind of down to earth, like specific things people have organized for and won recently, right? So campus affirmative consent policies, moving from a no means no framework to a yes means yes framework in terms of how like disciplinary actions are taken. Um, Comprehensive sexual education in K through 12 schools, consent education in K through 12 schools. Um, I won't walk through every one of these, but again, thinking about like specific things that can be won that will make a difference when it comes to creating a culture of consent. Um, I know other people have organized to move money in their school budgets um, toward like having restorative justice or transformative justice resources, so that when someone perpetrates harm, there are other options besides just punishment. But that's going to look different in different places. It's just to show that there are things people can do. And you can totally, again, screenshot any of this stuff or look at the zine. A lot of it's in the zine too. Um, but again, the basic big idea here is that, like I said, the three levels support each other: the individual, the interpersonal, and the institutional. And for change to happen, for culture to be built, it takes all three working in collaboration with one another. And as an individual, single human being, we all have different strengths, we all have different interests. You can find different ways to plug in, but the important thing is to find a way to plug in, right? It's never too early to join this type of work. And so again, the last, there's a lot of text here. The last page of the zine is just a resource list, which you can feel free to screenshot or just look at the link and see it there too. But people who just have no idea where to start, who know they want to work on this issue, but just, again, it's hard, it's intimidating. One of the best places to start is just to read more. We learn where we're going to go in this work, in this movement, through taking those first steps. And for a lot of people, it might just be reading a book. Chanel Miller's Know My Name is one of the most incredible books I've read in the past 10 years, right? A lot of really good stuff on this list, some of it more broad, some of it more specific. Sarah Deer is an incredible person who wrote about specifically confronting sexual violence in Native America. There's also Roxane Gay. Again, a million good resources there. Feel free to add even others in the chat box if you have good books or other recommendations. But again, that's the zine, right? I'm going to move on and share some poems in a second, but I just thought it was important to not just share poems, but to really bring along what I've learned from people who are doing this work about the way that we think about change, like social change, political change, building culture, isn't this like big, giant, magical thing. It's just everyday people choosing to take some specific actions, like what we've been talking about so far. Cool. Normally, yeah. Let me take a drink of water. If people have any thoughts, questions so far, and then we'll share a couple more poems, and then we'll be out of here.
All right,
Um,
y'all. Can you hear me all right, Kyle?
yeah.
All right, folks. So we've got the Q&A. The Q&A questions came in through that option in the chat. So moderators, if you all can get me those questions, I can pose them to Kyle with some of the time that we have left.
Okay. Yeah, and I can see them too.
Okay, cool. But I was just wanting to make a few comments, Kyle. It looks like, I know you haven't been able to follow the chat, but it looks like you got some new followers. People are asking where to find you on social media. So our moderators have sent them the YouTube on how to find you on SoundCloud and Instagram and your website. So please, folks, if you haven't already, please follow Guante to keep up with his work and activism. Just like he said, it's everyday people just like us choosing to take action, right? And that message is something that resonated with me. So if there are messages from Kyle's keynote that are resonating with you, feel free to pop them in the chat. I've got a question here for you. Kyle, what's one experience in particular that made you realize you needed to speak out about toxic masculinity and consent? Or was it something that you always thought about?
Yeah. So that's a fantastic question, and I'm looking at some of the other questions here too. And I think so. I'm going to answer the question, but I'm also going to dodge it a little bit because I think sometimes when we think about activism and like how do people get involved, we look for this one like lightning strike moment or a eureka moment, and I think a lot of us, some of us have those moments, and some of us don't. Right? Like for me, it was less one specific experience or moment than it was years of relationships and conversations and like people, mentors of mine who were older than me, who were doing this work, who like dragged me along with them to events and stuff. And like I think thinking about it in terms of a process as opposed to a specific like moment or whatever, can be really powerful. Especially, again, if you're someone who hasn't had that moment, but you still want to do the work, like do it, right? I think so much of it has been about just showing up. So like as an artist, a lot of that would be like open mics and poetry slams, right? Where even though the event might not specifically be about this issue would always come up. People would always be talking about it, and so I learned in those spaces. Part of it was taking classes, and if you have access to taking classes or whatever, learning in those spaces. But I would say so much of it is just informal, just relationships. When people ask how I got involved in this work, how I got involved in poetry, and how I got involved in music, like the answer is kind of the same thing for all three, which is relationships. Just friends, people I would like play basketball with or hang out with, just bringing me with them to stuff, to events, stuff like that. And I want to, I want to make sure I have time to share another poem or whatever too. But just looking at some of these other questions in the chat box, if we don't have time to answer them, I have a thought, right? So one of them is the idea of, do you have any advice for a trans man like myself? And as a cis guy, like I'm not gonna give you advice, right? Like that's I don't know if that's my place, but it's like an important question at the same time. I want to point to this is silly, but a podcast, right? I hosted or co-hosted like a 1-season podcast last year called What's Good, Man? And it was all about like, the subtitle was In Search of Healthy Masculinity. And we had a whole episode on the idea of is healthy masculinity something that, like, is there a healthy way to embody masculinity? Or is it more about like, how can I just be a good human being? And like, is gender part of that? And how is gender part of that? And again, there's no one answer. But when I hear a question like that, it makes me think of that episode, and how much of, the stuff that, it's a deep and complicated question, but I would point people in the direction of that episode of the podcast, which again, if it hasn't already been thrown into the chat box, I can do that. But the same with goodmanpod.com. Yeah, I think I wrote that right. The same, the question about the Me Too movement, the question, I know there was another question about masculinity and stuff, and about media. That's all stuff that we talked much more in depth about in the podcast. And so if that can be a resource, if people are the types to like sit and listen to podcasts, I hope that can be useful to you. Can I share another poem, and then we can end with some more Q&A stuff if stuff comes up?
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Um, and I also want to be sure to say that even though I'm sharing some of my own poems, spoken word is this incredible, beautiful, diverse like culture with all these people talking about stuff. So I wanted to share a screenshot of just, or not a screenshot, but just to shout out some other people who are doing really cool work around these issues. If you're interested in spoken word or poetry slams or whatever, like these are some good examples of poems that deal with this question of how do we build a culture of consent? How do we understand, these types of issues in a deeper way? And, that's a little transition here too, is like poetry for me, it doesn't have to be for you. I know not everybody likes poetry, and that's okay. But for me, it's been a way to engage in work that kind of touches on the 3 levels that we've been talking about. It's interpersonal mostly, in that it's like people telling stories and listening to stories, right? There's also a personal element in that writing something can be a way to process it. It can be healing, it can be therapeutic. It isn't always or automatically, but it can be. And then also on that like the larger institutional level, when 100 people are writing, when you write a poem about a topic and then you hear 10 other people writing about that same topic, and then, you know, there's hundreds of people writing about a topic, that pushes culture. And I know that like the conversations we're having today about masculinity and consent and healthy sexuality are not the conversations we were having 15 years ago. And I think that's a good thing. I think, you know, your generation is really pushing stuff in a healthier way. So yeah, let me throw another bit.ly into the chat box, which is just all these poems.
Okay,
So you don't have to like actually Google them.
got it.
That's a list.
Awesome. Thanks, Guante.
And then,
Which poem you
wait,
going into, and we'll share the screen.
sorry.
Which poem are you going into?
Oh yeah, you were gonna share the with the time that we have left. I mean, I should probably do the poem that's about consent, right? That probably makes sense. It's
I
called
would
Consent
love
at
to hear.
10,000 feet.
Consent at 10,000 feet. Does that
Yeah.
sound good, folks? All right. Go ahead. Cody is going to go ahead and share his screen. And again, thank you so much, Guante, for sending these in advance so we could have these on the screen.
Yeah, yeah.
In addition to having the links ready, that's
Oh
super
yeah, and
helpful.
again, I will also put the link in the chat box if people would rather. Oh, sorry, the chat moved on from where I was. It's going quickly. Um,
It's bumping. It's bumping.
yeah, this is also the link to the text and like the video. But and you know, this is a poem that I don't always get a chance to perform. There is, you know, a little bit of a content warning in that because it's a poem about consent, it also touches on sexual violence and assault. Um, and again, but I could talk about it forever. I'll just perform it and then we'll talk about it a little bit if people have thoughts or whatever. Cool. So this is called Consent at 10,000 feet. Um, have you ever had sex in a haunted house? Like, you know, you sneak in together and you're both laughing about it and you got it all planned out because you both worked there last Halloween or whatever. And you know the layout of the building, but then like a werewolf jumps out at you and it's like, ah, but then you find that one spare room and it's like, ah, you know, it's different. It's outside the box, but there's nothing wrong with it. You ever go to your roommate's play and end up hooking up with one of the supporting cast members, but they're like a method actor in the middle of a series of performances, so they never break character. And it's cool and it's funny, but their character is this like alternate universe steampunk Mercutio, and their blunderbuss keeps getting in the way, and you both laugh about it. And it's memorable. It's something beyond the norm, but there's nothing wrong with it. You ever have sex inside an enormous bowl of fettuccine alfredo that is suspended by chains between two sequoia trees because you're dating like a super avant-garde performance artist and wanted to draw attention to their new vanity publishing press, but you only have like 100 Twitter followers? Yeah, it's definitely an experience that is not easily replicated, but there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with any of these scenarios because in all of them, both partners are 100% flamboyantly beyond any shadow of a doubt down with what's happening. And the communication of that, both verbal and nonverbal, is clear and constant. This is consent. And wrong would be the absence of that in any context for any reason. It would be silence. It would be, I don't know if this is what I want right now. Because maybe that's not a no, but it is definitely not a yes. It would be just about everyone agreeing that rape is bad, but only when it's cold rape. How the amount of men who will admit to getting someone drunk or otherwise manipulating, coercing, or forcing them into a sexual act is so much larger than the amount of men who will admit to raping someone. How wrong is it to continue to talk about sexual assault like it's always that stranger lurking in the bushes, or always that cartoon caricature of a predatory frat boy and never the boyfriend or the girlfriend or the best friend or the ally or that really sweet guy from class? This is for that really sweet guy from class who might be asking, What about the gray areas, right? Like, what if we're just both really drunk? What if she sends mixed messages? What if I'm trying to do the right thing, but I read those signals wrong? Have you ever had sex while skydiving? Like, where you talk about consent the same way you talk about wearing a parachute. No gray areas, no assumptions like, I'm pretty sure I'm wearing a parachute. No questions. Like, I asked her to check my parachute and she didn't say anything, but it was okay last time, so I'm sure it's okay this time too. You ever had sex in a burning building when smoke and cinder wrapped itself around your neck, but coming was more important to you than going? Have you ever had sex on a life raft in the middle of the ocean surrounded by sharks? I'm not saying the water can't be cloudy. I'm just saying we are under no obligation to swim through it. Have you ever not had sex? Just hung out, watched a movie. Maybe if you both felt like it, kissed. Maybe if you both felt like it, made plans to go out again some other time. And then maybe days or weeks or whatever later, when you're both there and both ready and both smiling and both completely alive in your own bodies and both listening to each other fully. And maybe it isn't love, maybe it's just sex, and that's fine. But love is so much bigger than let's spend our lives together. Love is also let's spend this moment together as two or more people, present, electric, the opposite of gray, the embodiment of human, hands, eyes, lips, everything. Cool.
Woo.
So I know
Preach.
we're just about out of time, but I did want to say just really quickly, like, sometimes poetry, for those who are interested in spoken word, is this, like, intensely personal thing where we tell our stories, and that's important. That's an important part of it. But I think it's not the only function of poetry or art. If you're an artist of any kind, like, art can also be a tool to change the conversation we're having about a particular topic, to use images and stories and metaphors to reframe the, like, dominant way a particular topic or idea is talked about. Because that way people, with that poem, whether people like it or not isn't the point. Whether people agree with it or not isn't the point. The point is, how do we plant seeds that over time can be watered and cultivated in different ways. And that's just one part of that process of building a culture of consent. Is changing the stories that we tell about sexuality, about violence, about consent. Making sure that those stories reflect our realities, our lived experiences, and all that. So I hope that was interesting. We will go more into depth in this in the workshop that I'm doing later for those of you who are going to that. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyle. It looks like folks are giving you a virtual applause. You've got some comments. Powerful. Thank you. That was heavy. Appreciate you. Thank you so much. It was brilliant. Huge thanks to you, Guante. I know we've got a break between now and then. And if you all want to transition into Kyle's workshop, there will be more to come. And we've got a challenge before we go. Yeshia, if you would like to come off of mute and join us via video and share a little bit more about the Day 3 challenge.
All right. So for the challenge today, we would like you to post your favorite moment from the Teen Summit 2021 using the hashtag TSChallenge2021 and all your social medias. So Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, just so we can all get involved. And you can also just click on the hashtag in your social media and you can see what other people are also posting of and really connect with each other.
Awesome. Thank you, Keshia. So we invite you to get on social media, y'all. Use your social media, reach out to your networks, lean into this challenge, post your favorite moment from Teen Summit so far, and use the hashtag TSChallenge2021.